On a hill rising above the Volkhov River lies the felled idol of Perun, the very same one with a silver head and a golden mustache about which the primary chronicle wrote in such meticulous detail. Standing over it is a man well into his 50s looking down. Behind him stands a small armed retinue, a družina, and not a single one of these warriors utters a word, because, truth be told, there is simply nothing left to say here. The hill is called Peryn. The city down below is Novgorod. The year is 990, and the name of the man who is about to give the order to push the idol into the river is Dobrynya. Before we move any further, let us pause on one simple fact, for the sake of which, in essence, this entire episode has been made. He brought this idol here himself. 10 years ago, in 980, on the orders of the young Prince Vladimir, his own nephew, Dobrynya erected Perun on this very hill and forced the people of Novgorod to swear allegiance to it. He accepted their oaths, he accepted their sacrifices. The chronicles debate the scale of these sacrifices, but historians harbor very few doubts that they indeed took place. And yet, this morning, he chopped this very same Perun down. Before sunset, he will give the order to burn homes, and somewhere among those blazing roofs will be the street where he spent his own childhood. One man, two diametrically opposed cultic acts, both executed by his own hand, with exactly 10 years between them. That is the entire history of this episode, compressed into a single day and a single hill. How is something like this even possible? One could say that he was reborn, that the light finally touched his heart, that he renounced the darkness and embraced the truth. That is exactly how the hagiographies, the lives of the saints, would have written it, had they included Dobrynya. But Dobrynya did not make it into the hagiographies, and, to be perfectly honest, he does not much resemble a hagiographic hero. One could argue the exact opposite, that there was no genuine faith either the first time or the second time, and that what we have before us is a perfectly ordinary cynic in the service of the state. If that is true, however, it remains entirely unclear why he would carry this Peryn on his shoulders for 10 years, when he could have simply planted a cross from the very start. Neither of these two conventional explanations works in its entirety, and that is precisely why this historical figure is worth returning to in absolute earnest. We have a working theory for an answer, and we will be moving toward it throughout the entirety of this film, but to reveal it right now would be to cheapen the journey. Let us put it this way. The question you should keep in your mind from the very beginning is not why did the Rus adopt Christianity, nor is it even how exactly was Novgorod baptized. The question sounds entirely different. Why did this specific job have to be done by him? To make it clear where we are heading, let us establish a few introductory points. By the year 990, Kyiv has already been baptized, relatively peacefully, through silver and princely authority. The prince's city accepted the change from above, just as it had accepted previous changes. Novgorod, however, is a completely different story. It is a trading republic situated on a northern river, a city of powerful merchant clans, Varangian warbands, and a Veche, a popular assembly that knows perfectly well how to say no to a prince. To Novgorod, Vladimir sent the one and only man whom Novgorod truly knew, his own uncle, a man who had ruled there as a regent for 7 years, the man who had erected Perun right there, and, by all available evidence, a man who was genuinely loved in this city. Otherwise, what ultimately happened simply would not have taken place. And one last thing before we begin. In later historical memory, this man is known as Dobrynya Nikitich, the kind-hearted bogatyr, the mighty protector, the hero of epic folk tales, bilinas, and animated films. That is the specific form in which society agreed to remember him 200 years after his death. Memory knows how to protect itself, and sometimes it defends itself exactly like this, by transforming the executor of grueling, brutal state work into a fairy tale uncle with a mace. In this episode, we are going to look at what existed before memory protected itself. And we will have to start from very far away, because the man who will stand over the felled Perun in 990 was not born a military commander, nor was he born a royal relative. According to most sources, he was born a slave. To truly understand how a fully grown man proves capable of overhauling the faith of an entire city twice, we must go back very far to the years when he was neither a military commander, nor a regent, nor the uncle of a prince, but merely a boy at court, whose status was far more complicated than most. Let us start with his father. His name was Malk of Lubeck, that is, Malk from Lubeck, a town on the Dnieper River, situated just upriver from future Chernigov. The primary chronicle speaks of Malk briefly and dryly. He was the father of Malusha, the housekeeper of Princess Olga. From this brief mention grows the first historical knot that we must untangle with great care, because how we understand everything else depends entirely upon it. According to the canonical version, Malk was a dependent person at the princely court, something akin to a trusted servant, and his children, Malusha and Dobrynya, were born into this same dependent status. Malusha becomes Olga's housekeeper, or keykeeper, a position that is far from simple, as the housekeeper manages the royal provisions and controls access to the private chambers, but legally she remains a slave. Dobrynya is her brother, kept by her side, falling into the exact same category. This version, however, has a shadow trailing behind it. There is a hypothesis that Malk of Lubeck is actually Mal, the prince of the Drevliansk, the very same prince who killed Prince Igor in 945 and was brutally punished by Olga for doing so. According to this reconstruction, Olga did not merely take revenge on the Drevlians, she took the murdered prince's children to her court as hostages. Thus, Malusha and Dobrynya ended up in Kyiv not as the children of slaves, but as captive princelings under the strict supervision of their conqueror. It sounds like a beautiful narrative. This version has its dedicated supporters among historians, and ignoring it would be patently unfair. But we will not accept it as absolute fact either. There is no direct confirmation in the primary sources, and the majority of specialists still lean toward the simpler Verziana slave family that earned its standing at court. For our story, however, it does not actually matter which of the two versions is closer to the truth. What matters is that both of them describe the exact same situation for the boy, a stranger among his own people, and one of his own among strangers. If Malk is a slave, then Dobrynya grows up by the prince's hearth, but he never forgets for a second that the hearth is not his. If Malk is a defeated prince, then Dobrynya grows up by that same hearth, but remembers that this hearth devastated his own bloodline. In either case, from his earliest childhood, he is forced to solve the exact same problem: how to be useful to a house that does not consider him its own. Dobrynya solves this problem. He grew up alongside his sister, and in the sources, a very specific word becomes permanently attached to him, one that would remain in the Russian language for a long time. Uy, the mother's brother, the maternal uncle. Olga kept Malusha close to her in the royal chambers, and someone had to protect this girl from a dependent family in a world where a dependent girl at a princely court is always, without exception, a vulnerable girl. The brother took on this job, not by any formal order, but according to the very logic that would come to govern his entire life. Family is what you protect first and foremost. Before princes, before gods, before your own personal interests. At some point, the sources do not name an exact date, but it is either the late 950s or the very early 960s, Malusha caught the eye of Sviatoslav, Olga's son. He was a young warrior prince who rarely spent time at home and had very little interest in his mother's domestic rules. The history of their liaison is material for an entirely different episode, and we will not retell it here. We will only say that this liaison produced a highly specific result. Malusha became pregnant. Olga's reaction is the only thing in this narrative that is described in vivid detail. The princess was absolutely furious. Not because her son had engaged with a woman from the servants' quarters that was a perfectly ordinary occurrence and was not considered grounds for a scandal, but because Olga by this time was already a Christian, having been baptized in Constantinople, and she treated her son's matrimonial affairs quite differently than her own mother would have. Malusha was removed from the royal chambers. She was exiled to Budatino, a small princely village, and there, far removed from the court, she gave birth to a son. It was around the year 960. The exact date remains unknown. They named the boy Vladimir. Here it is vital that we pause and look at this exact same scene from a completely different angle. From Dobrynya's perspective, his sister is sent away from the royal court. The child is essentially born in disgrace, and the status of their entire family becomes even more ambiguous than it already was. On the one hand, Malusha now has a son by the prince. This changes absolutely everything. On the other hand, this son is utterly unwanted by his princely grandmother, born in exile, and formerly considered a robichich, that is, the son of a slave. This word will stick to him for a very long time, and 18 years later, another princess, over in Polotsk, will throw it right in his face. For now, however, Dobrynya, who at this point is a young man, around 20 years old, has to accept an incredibly uncomfortable truth. His nephew has been born, and his nephew is not just a princely bastard. He is a princely bastard who has not a single protector at court, other than his mother and her brother. Olga tolerates the boy, but she does not draw him close. Sviatoslav is constantly away fighting wars, and rarely appears at home. His older sons, Yarapok and Oleg, were born to a different woman and are considered the legitimate heirs. From the very beginning, Vladimir is the third wheel, the extra one, the one who will be forgotten first, if the political situation ever allows him to be forgotten. And it is precisely at this point that the core of Dobrynya's entire future biography is formed. The boy desperately needs an adult who will always be there. Not an educator in the formal sense, not a royal tutor, but a man whose very life is tied to the child's life by blood. The uncle becomes this man. This decision was most likely never formalized with words. It simply happened. Malusha went to Budatino. The boy grew up caught between the village and the royal court, and the brother of his mother increasingly found himself by his side. Dobrynya did not actively choose this. He was already the sworn protector of his sister, and now her son was added to the equation. The logic remains the same. The object of his protection merely doubled. By the end of the 960s, Sviatoslav had become completely engrossed in his southern campaigns. Bulgaria, the Danube, the wars against the Pechenegs. He was rarely at home, he saw his heirs even less frequently, and at a certain point, on the eve of yet another massive military campaign, a question that had previously been delayed had to be answered: what to do with his sons. The elder ones, Yaropolk and Oleg, were given their shares. Yaropolk was given Kyiv, Oleg was given the Drevlian land. Vladimir presented a much more difficult problem. He was not considered a legitimate heir, nobody in Kyiv was particularly eager to have him around, and a place had to be found for him that would neither insult him nor bring him too close to the throne. An unexpected chance intervenedor, rather, intense political pressure from the north. According to the account in the primary chronicle, at this exact moment, the people of Novgorod came to Sviatoslav and demanded a prince for themselves. Novgorod vehemently disliked living without a princely governor, because without one, the city invariably started feeling far too independent far too quickly, and both sides understood this dynamic perfectly well. Sviatoslav replied that he simply had no one left to give them. Yaropolk was already seated in Kyiv, Oleg was in the Drevlian land, and he had no other sons. The Novgorodians responded bluntly, "If you do not give us anyone, we will find a prince ourselves." And that was an undisguised threat to secede from Kyiv entirely, quite possibly in favor of their Varangian kin across the sea. And it was then that someone gently reminded the prince that Sviatoslav did, in fact, have one more son. The chronicle attributes these words to Dobrynya himself, and if this is true, it appears to be the one and only instance in his entire biography where our protagonist speaks up for himself in a major political narrative, rather than acting strictly behind someone else's back. "Ask for Vladimir," he quietly suggested to the Novgorodians. The Novgorodians asked. Sviatoslav agreed. Vladimir remained the sole unplaced son, and Novgorod, which would otherwise have slipped out from under Kyiv's control, now remained securely within the royal family's grasp. The year is 970. Vladimir is about 10 years old. He is handed Novgorod's massive, mercantile, fiercely willful city located on a northern river, boasting its own Veche assembly and its own distinct will. It was a city that the southern princely court always viewed as something akin to a distant, incredibly wealthy province that did not fully grasp who was actually in charge. A 10-year-old boy, of course, cannot rule this city. Absolutely everyone understands this. Therefore, traveling alongside Vladimir to Novgorod is his uncle, the only adult at the royal court who could possibly be trusted with a half-blood child possessing an entirely uncertain future. Thus, Dobrynya finds himself in Novgorod for the very first time, in a city where he is destined to spend 7 years as regent, where he will memorize every single street, every merchant estate, every face in the market square. And it is this very city to which he will return 20 years later, carrying a brutal order given to him by this very same boy, who by that time will be the Grand Prince of Kyiv. But that moment is still a long way off. For now, there is only a longboat, slowly making its way up the Dnieper River, then over the land portages, then down the Lovet River, then into Lake Ilmen. Standing at the prow of the longboat is a 10-year-old boy, staring intently at the water. Beside him stands a grown man who has just been entrusted with his very life, and neither of them knows yet that this water is the Volga River, the very water into which, 30 years later, they will jointly drown a god. To truly appreciate what exactly Vladimir and Dobrynya inherited in 970, we need to understand one crucial fact that is rarely stated outright. The Novgorod of that era was not a part of Rus in the same way that Kyiv or Chernigov was a part of Rus. It was an entirely different country, speaking the exact same language. The southern principalities grew out of the power of the Druzhina, the prince and his armed retainers, relying on tribute forcibly extracted from subordinate tribes. Novgorod, by contrast, grew out of trade. It stands squarely at the intersection of two massive water routes, from the Baltic Sea to the Volga River, and from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea. Absolutely everything that Northern Europe trades with the East passes right through it. Furs, silver, wax, slaves, weapons. The city is obscenely wealthy because of this, and this wealth does not belong to the prince. It belongs to the powerful merchant clans who, by and large, built this city in the first place. The prince in Novgorod is a hired figure. He is not elected by the Veche, as he would be in later centuries, but he is certainly not the absolute master in the southern sense of the word either. He sits there only for as long as the city is willing to tolerate him. Operating alongside these merchant clans is the Varangian Dobrynya mercenary by origin, and not entirely subordinate to either the prince or the townsfolk. Behind this warband lie deep connections to Scandinavia, steady and permanent, because half of the Varangian houses in Novgorod have relatives in Birka, Hedeby, or on Gotland. Down below, underneath all of this, lies the Slavic and Finno-Ugric population of the surrounding lands. They are the tribute payers, the absolute foundation of the economy, and a constant, simmering source of tension, because tribute must be collected from them in an amount just small enough to prevent a rebellion, yet frequently enough so they never have time to forget who the master is. And standing high above all of this is the Veche, the city assembly. In principle, any free resident can attend it, but in practice, only those who actually matter show up. The heads of the great clans, the senior merchants, the representatives of the end, the city boroughs, each possessing its own distinct character and its own vested interests. The Veche decides questions of war, peace, taxation, relations with the prince, and, when strictly necessary, relations with the prince as a human being. If the city does not like the prince, the Veche can, and this will happen numerous times throughout Novgorodian history, politely ask him to leave. It is into this very city in 970 that a 10-year-old half-blood boy, born of a slave woman, is brought, and alongside him is an adult man from that exact same dependent family, who is now expected to rule here in the boy's name. On paper, it looks like the standard appointment of a governor. In reality, it is a perilous trial that has every chance of ending disastrously. However, it ends quite differently, and this is the first pivotal turning point on which we must pause, because without it, it will be impossible to understand why, 20 years later, it is specifically Dobrynya who is sent back here to baptize the city. Dobrynya learns to manage Novgorod by Novgorodian rules. This is not an obvious decision. It would have been far more conventional to try to establish himself like a heavy-handed southern warlord, to exert pressure via the Dobrynya, demand absolute submission, and forcefully break the Veche. This had been done before, and it would be done again. Dobrynya chooses a different path. He begins by talking. He finds a common language with the merchant elders. He never challenges their privileges and does not meddle in their private affairs, provided their affairs do not directly infringe upon the prince's interests. He accepts the Varangian commanders exactly as they are mercenaries who serve for silver, and he pays them flawlessly. He does not try to remake the Veche, nor does he attempt to bypass it. Whenever a decision is required that the city might stubbornly reject, he goes to negotiate well in advance, meeting privately with the men who set the tone at the Veche, and he arrives at the assembly with a prepackaged consensus, already hammered out in the back rooms. Down in the southern principalities, this would be labeled weakness. Up in Novgorod, it was called, "The Prince knows how to live our way." And that was the absolute highest praise this city ever agreed to bestow. By the mid-970s, Dobrynya has built a solid circle of people in Novgorod upon whom he can reliably lean. Among them, and this is absolutely vital for our narrative, is the old high priest of Perun, a figure who is named only in later sources, but who was already highly prominent during these years. The Wakim Chronicle, which we will discuss separately a bit later, calls him Bogomil and adds a telling explanation. For his sweet speech, he was named the Nightingale. It is an incredibly revealing moniker. Bogomil is not a warrior, not a merchant, not a politician in the traditional sense. He is a man people listen to simply because he knows how to speak. He is the high priest of the city's main sanctuary, the keeper of the sacred rituals, the crucial intermediary between the community and the divine forces in which this community believes. During the 970s, Dobrynya is an ally of this man. This is not a friendship in the modern, emotional sense. It is a pragmatic, working partnership between two highly intelligent men who understand that the city is a complex organism and can only be held together if they do it in tandem. The prince managing the outside, the priest managing the inside. They are exactly the same age, both are approaching 40 at this point. Both achieved their high power, not through noble birth, but through service. Both know intimately that Novgorod deeply distrusts outsiders and only favors those who know how to talk to it. Remember this pairing well. We will encounter them several more times, and every single time they will appear in a radically new configuration. 7 years in Novgorod is not a short span of time. During these critical years, Vladimir transforms from a young boy into an adolescent, and then into a young man. Dobrynya teaches him absolutely everything an uncle can teach a nephew, under the distinct condition that the uncle is only just learning all of this himself. How to read the shifting moods of the Veche by studying faces, how to speak to a Varangian centurion so he does not suspect a slight, how to calculate taxes in a way that ensures the merchants actually pay rather than smuggling their goods around the city. By the age of 17, Vladimir possesses his own deeply ingrained understanding of how power works. And, unlike the philosophy held by his father Sviatoslav, Vladimir's view has very little in common with the heavy-handed model of the military druzhina. Vladimir, having grown up in Novgorod, knows inherently that one can rule with silver and with words, not just with a sword. This knowledge will serve him extraordinarily well when it comes time for him to baptize Kyiv. And then, in the year 977, a devastating message arrives from the south, abruptly terminating the Novgorodian regency in a single instant. Sviatoslav had perished back in 972, ambushed on the Dnieper rapids. During the 5 years that followed his death, his sons, Yaropolk, ruling in Kyiv, and Oleg, ruling in the Drevlian land, managed to fatally quarrel. The initial pretext was a hunting dispute. A warrior of Yaropolk's retinue was killed on Oleg's land over a private feud, and Yaropolk, not bothering to sort out who was right, marched to war against his brother. We analyze this entire history in deep detail in our episode about the commander Sven-Eld. Oleg lost the battle near the city of Ovruch, retreated toward the fortress gates, and in a horrific crush on the bridge was thrown into the moat along with horses and men. When his body was finally recovered, Yaropolk, according to the chronicle, wept over his brother and swore he had never wanted his death. Whether he actually wept or not is irrelevant to our story. What matters is that following Oleg's death, Yaropolk had only one unoccupied brother left, sitting far away in Novgorod. In Novgorod, they fully grasp the implications of this long before anyone in the south has time to act. The messenger arrives from the south, bringing the news to Dobrynya, and Dobrynya makes a decision incredibly fast. So fast, in fact, that this speed clearly reveals he had been keeping this contingency plan ready for a very long time. They absolutely cannot stay. Yaropolk will not stop. Having eliminated one brother, he will almost certainly eliminate the second, because otherwise Novgorod will inevitably become the staging ground for future revenge. Vladimir cannot defend himself with his own forces. She commands the city's militia, yes, but it will never hold out against the seasoned Kievan army, and the Veche will certainly not go to war to fight someone else's battle. There is only one option left: to run. Not into the southern lands, where Yaropolk can easily reach them, but to a place where absolutely no one can touch them, across the sea, to their Varangian kin. The Novgorodian court has deep connections in Scandinavia. The names of the local rulers are known, and they can hire exactly as many mercenaries there as they are willing to pay for. The primary goal is to buy precious time and gather a massive military force. Dobrynya and Vladimir leave. They depart swiftly, under the cover of night, taking only a small retinue, leaving Novgorod in the care of those very same merchant elders, and that very same Bogomil, the only people they can realistically trust, because there is simply no one else to trust. The city solemn swears to wait for their return. The city will keep that promise. They spend an entire year across the sea assembling a war band, negotiating, forging alliances that are described in the historical sources with far less detail than we would prefer. The Scandinavian side of this saga is rich material for a separate analysis, and we will not dive into it now. For our narrative, it is sufficient to know that in 978, Vladimir returns to Novgorod not as an adolescent under a regency, but as a young prince marching at the head of a massive Varangian army. And with this terrifying new force, he does not march on Kyiv directly. The road to Kyiv runs right through another city, a city whose daughter recently rejected him. He marches through Polotsk. Their return from across the sea in 978 looks precisely like a direct military campaign aimed at Kyiv. But the very first blow that Vladimir and Dobrynya strike is not directed at Kyiv at all. It falls upon Polotsk, strategic city situated on the western Dwina River, ruled by the Varangian chieftain Volod. And it is precisely during these critical months that the question of a massive dynastic alliance between Polotsk and Yaropolk is being actively decided. Volod has a daughter named Rogneda, and they are preparing to give her in marriage to the Kievan prince. For Vladimir, this signifies only one thing. He will have to fight his way into Kyiv against a massive, unified force, and his chances of ultimate success will plummet drastically. The flawlessly logical move is to intercept the bride. Vladimir ostentatiously sends his own matchmakers to Polotsk to cut off the Kievan delegation. It is a standard political calculation. It is far more advantageous for Polotsk to remain neutral, and Volod, if given a graceful diplomatic out, will likely agree. We analyzed the intricate details of this rejection in our dedicated history of Rogneda herself, and we will not rehash them here. What is critical is exactly what she answered and the specific words she chose to use. I do not wish to unshoe the son of a slave, but I want Yaropolk. To unshoe, to ceremonially remove the groom's footwear on the wedding night, a profound ritual signifying entry into his household. Refusing to unshoe him is an absolute refusal of the alliance, articulated in the one specific form that everyone in this world understands without translation. It was a vicious blow, but it was not the main one. The main blow was that word, Robichich, the son of a slave. And right here we must pivot our gaze away from Vladimir and look directly at Dobrynya.
because from this exact moment onward, the Polotsk narrative ceases to be diplomatic and becomes intensely, brutally personal. The son of a slave does not just refer to Vladimir. It refers to Malusha, who gave birth to this son of a slave. It refers to Malk of Lyabech, whose daughter is a slave. It refers to the entire family line from which Dobrynya himself descends.
With one single phrase, the Princess of Polotsk publicly branded their entire bloodline as fundamentally too low to intermarry with hers. And she did so openly, in a formal diplomatic response that would instantaneously become known to absolutely everyone tracking the geopolitical alignments in this part of the world. What happens next is described very sparsely in the primary chronicle, and hiding behind that sparse description is a calculated decision almost certainly not made by the young Vladimir. The young Vladimir is an insulted 18-year-old youth, and an insulted youth generally does something wildly impulsive and extremely expensive. What follows does not look impulsive in the slightest. It looks utterly cold. The massive army, which had not yet dispersed after returning from across the sea, pivots and marches on the Dvina. Polotsk is utterly sacked. Rogvolod is slaughtered. His sons are slaughtered. Rognida is forcefully taken as Vladimir's wife, violently, right before the eyes of her still-living parents. The word modern language applies to this act is rape. The word the era used was taking. The vast difference between these two words is exactly 1,000 years. The sources do not state explicitly that Dobrynya drafted the plan for this campaign, but the sheer logic of the figures on the board leaves no other viable candidate. Standing beside Vladimir is one single adult man who intimately knows how to plan military campaigns and who harbors a deeply personal grievance against the phrase, "the son of a slave," because that specific word was hurled at his sister and his father. The family has been deeply insulted, and the man who answers for the family is the exact same man who has always answered for it. This is the first time we see Dobrynya in pure, unfiltered action, and we must linger on it. He does not act like a grand ideologue uniting Rus, nor does he act like a grand strategist executing a visionary plan. He acts strictly as a brother. Polotsk's response is an unforgivable strike against his house, and a strike against his house is answered in the exact way he knows how, proportionately, brutally, and as publicly as possible, so that anyone else contemplating a similar move will remember it forever. Commit this character trait to memory, because 12 years later, back in Novgorod, Dobrynya will behave according to a completely different logic, and this apparent contradiction will severely confuse many. But it will not confuse us, provided we remember the core truth. He is no ideologue. He is merely a function of his bloodline. Ideas can be easily swapped out. The bloodline cannot. The road to Kyiv is wide open after Polotsk. What follows happens rapidly and is well known from the chronicles. Yarapolk cannot hold the field and locks himself behind the walls of Kyiv. His trusted commander, Blood, seduced by the promise of maintaining his high status, convinces the prince to exit the city for peace negotiations. Yarapolk steps out. 2 Varangian mercenaries from Vladimir's retinue hoist him upon their swords the moment he steps into the tent's doorway. In 980, Vladimir enters Kyiv as Grand Prince. He is around 20 years old. Trailing behind him is the sacked city of Polotsk, a violently acquired wife, a murdered brother, and the uncle who meticulously orchestrated absolutely all of it. And now, this uncle must make his next massive decision. No longer a military one, but a religious one. The very first decision of his life regarding exactly what an entire country should believe. Having triumphantly entered Kyiv, Vladimir did precisely what any highly intelligent man in his position would do, understanding that violently seizing a city and successfully holding a city are two completely different tasks. He began thinking about how to hold it. The position of the young Grand Prince was, to put it mildly, precarious. Under his formal authority lay vast lands that for decades had lived entirely separate lives. The Polyanians around Kyiv, the Drevlians, the Severians, the Krivichians, the Novgorod Slovenes, the Radomichians, the Vyatichians. Every single one of these tribes had its own entrenched nobility, its own armed warbands, its own sacred sanctuaries, its own localized gods, and its own very specific idea of exactly how seriously they should take the man sitting in Kyiv. They paid tributes, some diligently, some with endless caveats, some only after a brutal military expedition forced them to. But there was absolutely no unified space in which all these disparate people felt like inhabitants of a single cohesive country. What existed instead was a fragile network of relationships, with the prince sitting at the dead center, and this entire network held together solely because the prince happened to be militarily stronger than any single one of its individual nodes. Trying to hold such a massive network together by raw force alone guarantees perpetual war. Sviatoslav, Vladimir's father, had done exactly that, and as a direct result, he perished in an ambush on the river rapids because his forces were exhausted and dangerously overextended from their rear bases. Vladimir, having grown up in Novgorod and having watched firsthand how similar results could be achieved far more effectively with silver and words, aggressively sought a different solution. The solution he arrived at, or rather, the solution he was carefully steered toward, is referred to in history textbooks as the pagan reform of 980. It is a profoundly deceptive name because the word reform implies bringing order to something that already exists, whereas here the goal was creating something that had never existed before. High above the princely court, right on the hill, a grand pantheon is erected. 6 towering idols. Perun, the god of the military retinue, the god of thunder and war. Korsun, solar deity belonging to the southern, most likely Iranian-originated cultural sphere. Dazbog, also a solar god, but hailing from an entirely different, deeply Slavic stratum. Strabog intimately tied to the wind, to open space, to long roads. Simmerglan, obscure, mysterious figure, possibly an Iranian borrowing, acting as a guardian of crops or sacred fire. Makashthi, single female deity in this entire lineup, deeply connected to the earth, to spinning, to the fate of women. We are not going to describe each of them in granular detail. That is material for an entirely different discussion. What is vital here is to look at the construction as a whole. There is not a single random figure in this lineup. Every single deity serves as the symbolic representative of one of the tribal pantheons that make up Vladimir's sprawling realm. Perun is, first and foremost, the god of Kyiv and the princely warband. Dazbog is the ancient god of the Polyanians. Makash represents the Finno-Ugric layer, already deeply assimilated by the Slavs. Kors in Simmergl represent southern borrowings, acquired through extensive trade contacts with the open steppe and the Transcaucasus. Stribog is pan-Slavic. If you look at that hill looming above the prince's courtyard in 980, you do not see a genuine religious map of the world. You see a stark political map, masterfully translated into wood and silver. and standing at the absolute head of this map is Perun. He is not merely first among equals, he is first in sheer height, in the overwhelming richness of his decoration, in his central placement. The primary chronicle emphasizes his appearance quite deliberately: a silver head, a golden moustache, a body carved from wood. This is supreme status, boldly declared through physical material. Perun is the prince's god, and through Perun, the prince now speaks to all the other gods, exactly as he speaks to all the other tribes through his military commanders. The construction, generally speaking, is not unique.
The Roman capital was structured in a very similar fashion, deliberately gathering the gods of conquered peoples into one place, as was the Byzantine imperial cult, where the Christian emperor seamlessly assumed the absolute central role previously occupied by the emperor-pontiff. Whoever conceptualized the Kievan pantheon, and it is highly unlikely that Vladimir, a young man, managed to do this entirely alone, knew exactly what he was doing and leaned on a proven model he had either seen or heard about. The underlying idea is brilliantly simple. Standing above each tribe is its specific god, standing above all the gods is Perun, and standing above Perun is the prince. Above the prince, there is no one. The sources never reveal exactly who invented this, but if we look closely at who in Vladimir's inner circle at that specific moment possessed real-world experience managing a massive city populated by people of wildly different tribes and different gods, we see only one man. 7 long years in Novgorod, where Varangians, Slovenes, Chud, Meria, and merchants from across the entire northern world managed to coexist under a single municipal authority that is the exact school where a man learns to view faith primarily as an instrument of state control. We cannot definitively prove that Dobrynya himself proposed the pantheon, but we can confidently state that it did not happen without his direct involvement. The grand reform on the Kievan hill is merely the first act. The second act absolutely has to unfold in the north, and here Vladimir makes a decision where the deeply personal and the highly political violently converge on a single point.
Peryn must be installed in Novgorod as well, not the entire grand pantheon. That would be completely excessive and would needlessly confuse the Novgorodians, who already possessed their own familiar gods and their own local hierarchies, but specifically Peryn, just him, the supreme one, the one through whom Kiev now dictates to everyone else. And the man tasked with delivering this god to the north is the one who intimately knows Novgorod better than anyone else in the prince's entire entourage. His uncle, Dobrynya, rides into Novgorod in 980, not as a hostile, foreign envoy dispatched from Kiev. He arrives as a man who expertly governed this city for 7 years, a man who maintains a robust network of acquaintances here, and a man who, most importantly for our narrative, still has Bogomil here.
Their meeting at Peryn, on the high hill rising above the Volkhov, that the city has revered as profoundly sacred for generations, is the very first scene in which Bogomil does not merely get mentioned in passing, he actually appears. And he does not appear as an enemy. Let us try to see this scene through the eyes of both men. Bogomil is around 40 years old at this point. He is the revered high priest of the city's primary sanctuary, a man people listen to because he knows exactly how to speak. That specific moniker, the Nightingale, which has firmly attached itself to him, is not a polite compliment regarding his musicality. It is a clinical observation of his primary weapon, his voice, the word. His unique ability to explain to the city exactly what the city needs to have explained to it. He greets Dobrynya exactly as one greets an old acquaintance, because they are old acquaintances. They spent 7 crucial years of a regency in the exact same city, playing deeply connected, complementary roles. Dobrynya arrives bearing the idol, the very same one, possessing a gleaming silver head and a golden mustache, or perhaps an exact replica crafted following the identical template specifically for Novgorod. The ancient sources remain silent on this detail. He does not bring it in as a conquered trophy, nor does he bring it as a hostile imposed deity. He brings it in as a political proposition, physically carved into wood. Bogomil willingly accepts this proposition, and, crucially, he does so without the slightest resistance and without any hidden agenda. To him, the grand installation of Perun at Peryn does not feel like the forced substitution of Novgorodian faith with a foreign one. Perun already exists within their local faith. The sacred sanctuary on this hill has been standing for years. What Dobrynya has brought is not interpreted as a hostile replacement, but as a massive elevation in status. The local Novgorodian Perun is now officially the supreme Perun of all Rus. The prince down in Kyiv swears his oaths in his name, and allegiances from all the sprawling lands flow directly toward him. For the city's high priest, this serves as absolute, state-level validation of his own deep righteousness. For Dobrynya, and this is the critical divergence that we must recognize, something entirely different is unfolding. A purely political gesture is taking place. Perun is being erected in Novgorod, not so that the Novgorodians might pray better, but solely so that Novgorod unequivocally recognizes Kievan order. The actual theological substance of the faith is, in all probability, utterly meaningless to Dobrynya. The substance of raw power, however, is not.
The two men stand together on the hill, silently watching as the towering idol is hauled up and firmly planted in the earth. The armed retinue loudly swears its oaths of loyalty. Bogomil majestically intones the sacred words that are meant to be intoned. Dobrynya remains silent. 10 years from now, he will stand on this exact same spot, and the only thing left of this towering idol will be a deep scar gouged into the dirt. But at this moment, neither man knows this. Today, they are staunch allies, and this is not a convenient delusion. It is a perfectly accurate description of the current day. One man brought a god, the other accepted him. One solidified the absolute power of his prince, the other elevated the prestige of his city. Everything that will happen later will only happen later, specifically because a brand new order will arrive. And when forced to choose between his current ally and the future order of his prince, Dobrynya will choose the order without hesitation, because for him, the guiding ideology is easily interchangeable, but his bloodline is not. For now, however, the mighty idol stands. The city has accepted it. The warband piles back into their longboats. Dobrynya journeys back to Kyiv to report that Novgorod has fully integrated into the new reform. 10 years of relatively unbroken peace begin from this exact day. Lying exactly between the grand installation of Perun at Peryn and the horrific events that will unfold in Novgorod 10 years later, is a relatively quiet stretch in Dobrynya's life, and we need to step into it, if only for a brief moment. Not because something profoundly earth-shattering occurred during these specific years, but because without seeing them, it is impossible to grasp exactly who Dobrynya had become by the time his era began to fracture. By all available indicators, he was standing at the absolute summit.
The 980s represent a golden period when everything works perfectly for Vladimir. The sprawling territories hold firm, the tribute flows uninterrupted, and the tribal elites acknowledge the Kievan order, some willingly, others through gritted teeth, but entirely without open rebellion. Military campaigns directed against the fractured Viatichians and Radimichians conclude in sweeping victories. The distant external borders slowly stabilize. A fragile but functional peace is struck with the nomadic Pechenegs. Highly lucrative trade networks are carefully calibrated with Byzantium, and the heavy Varangian mercenary forces cease being the primary military backbone, seamlessly replaced by a mixed army. This happens partly because the Varangians had simply become too expensive to maintain, and partly because Vladimir finally learned how to effectively rely on his own native forces. Standing right beside the prince is his uncle. Their relationship during these years is exactly what later political language would term a co-rulership, even though no formal title of co-ruler exists. The reality is simple. Whatever the prince decides, he decides only after closely consulting with Dobrynya, and Dobrynya, in turn, goes out of his way to ensure that all of his own private advice looks exactly like the prince's unilateral decisions. It is simply more convenient for everyone involved. In 985, this powerful duo is observed waging war together for the very first time, not in a setup where Dobrynya commands the armies in the field, while Vladimir safely remains behind in Kyiv, but side by side, sharing the exact same campaign and the exact same conditions. The target of this major expedition is the Volga Bulgars. The mighty state of the Volga Bulgars is a genuinely formidable neighbor. It sits proudly on the middle Volga, aggressively controls a massive segment of the crucial trade route running from the Varangians down to the Arab East, trades heavily in furs, silver, and slaves, and it converted to Islam way back in the early 10th century, long before Rus even began seriously pondering its own choice of faith. It is obscenely wealthy, highly organized, boasting its own fortified cities and its own standing army. Waging a serious war against them is an incredibly expensive undertaking, and the precise reason Vladimir marches against them in 985 is stated rather vaguely in the chronicles. Perhaps it was a series of volatile border disputes. Perhaps it was mounting pressure from the Pechenegs, or perhaps it was just another calculated attempt to violently dictate who truly controlled the river trade. The military campaign moves rapidly down the Volga. The army is a sprawling, mixed force, Rus and Varangian warriors, reinforced by the Turks, their nomadic steppe allies. They seize captives, smash through several scattered detachments, penetrate deep into Bulgar territory, and, depending on which historical reconstruction you favor, they either lay siege to one of the massively fortified settlements or test the Bulgar army in open battle. The granular details of the campaign are sparse in the primary chronicle, and we will not meticulously reconstruct them here. Only one thing truly matters. The decisive military advantage ultimately belonged to Vladimir, and the pressing question arose, what exactly should be done with this massive advantage? And it is right here that a brief, brilliant scene takes place, one the chronicle preserved almost entirely verbatim. It was preserved so vividly that it was likely passed around as a military anecdote for decades afterward. Dobrynya is slowly inspecting the captured prisoners. This is standard, grueling, routine work. Counting them, appraising their physical worth, calculating exactly how much silver they will fetch at the slave markets, estimating the maximum tribute they can actually squeeze out of the defeated side, and deciding exactly how to frame the final terms of peace. He stares intently at these captive men, and then he turns smoothly to his nephew. "These ones wear boots. They will not pay us tribute. Let us go look for the bast shoe wearers."
It is a statement far shorter than most proverbs, and it is delivered with a deeply specific meaning that must be unpacked. Boots equal high status. They signify that the captives had enough money to afford leather boots, that they belong to an advanced society, accustomed to cities, to complex craftsmanship, to sophisticated commodity money relations. Bast, shoes woven from bark, represent deep rural poverty, the isolated tribal hinterlands, the raw tribute payers in their most primitive, exploitable form. Dobrynya's underlying logic is perfectly transparent. You simply cannot extract a steady, long-term tribute by brute force from a wealthy, highly organized nation. They will pay you today, but tomorrow they will muster a new army and refuse to pay. And a year from now, they will march right back to your borders, demanding blood. But from a desperately poor, fractured tribal people, from them you can take and keep taking reliably, forever, simply because they have nothing to fight back with.
But the Bulgars are not bast shoe wearers. They are the men in the boots. This means that the financial profit from this specific war will be strictly a one-time payout, while the ensuing problems will haunt them for years to come. From this cold calculation, Dobrynya draws a conclusion that, for a warlord of that brutal era, sounds almost entirely indecent. They need to make peace with the Bulgars. Do not attempt to finish them off. Do not issue maximum, humiliating demands. Do not try to permanently subjugate them. Instead, forge a peace treaty, preferably a highly durable one, firmly rooted in mutual respect. Vladimir agrees, and a historic peace is indeed signed with the Bulgars, sworn through a formal oath that features the highly symbolic formula: "Let there be no war between us until stone begins to float and hops begin to sink," meaning until the absolute impossible occurs. This specific peace, generally speaking, would hold firm for many decades to come.
If we linger on this exact scene, several crucial realities become visible all at once. It is abundantly clear that, at this moment, Dobrynya is absolutely not a warrior bound by the traditional ethics of the Druzyna. A warrior governed by those ethics always finishes the enemy off, because to finish them off means to seize maximum plunder, divide it generously among the warband, and dramatically confirm his own elevated status in their eyes. Dobrynya does not finish them off because he is calculating the profit 20 years into the future rather than focusing on the next 3 months. This is not the narrow lens of a warlord. This is the expansive lens of a true statesman. It is also clear that Vladimir listens to him. He does not aggressively argue. He does not attempt to publicly flaunt his own sovereign will. He simply agrees. In his early 30s, standing at the absolute pinnacle of a victorious military campaign, under the hungry gaze of an armed retinue desperately waiting to plunder, the prince accepts his uncle's advice without a hint of resistance. This speaks volumes about the deep nature of their relationship during these years. Finally, it is clear that Dobrynya knows how to retreat. He accurately assesses a situation where pushing further is utterly pointless, and he coolly proposes stepping back. This is an incredibly rare skill, both among military commanders and among politicians. Remember this trait, because 5 years from now, in Novgorod, he will face the exact same scenario.
glaringly obvious signs that pushing is pointless, a crystal clear understanding that the ultimate price in blood will be catastrophic, and a wide open opportunity to retreat or simply hand the grim task off to someone else. And he will not retreat, not because he will have forgotten how it is done, but because the underlying dynamic in Novgorod will be fundamentally different, and we are about to see exactly how. For now, however, it is summer on the Volga. A solid peace has been secured, and the longboats are rowing steadily back west. Vladimir and Dobrynya sail toward home like two men perfectly satisfied with a job flawlessly executed. Between them lies that profound, unspoken trust that builds agonizingly slowly and holds without the need for words. But over the next 5 years, this trust will begin to subtly mutate. Because already traveling toward Kyiv from Korsun is a man who will entirely rewrite the rules of the game. This man's name is Anastas. We have already dissected the detailed history of his arrival in a separate episode. But he will enter Dobrynya's life very soon, and he will enter it not as an enemy charging across an open battlefield, but as a man who fundamentally alters the prevailing agenda. And the very first thing this brand new agenda will mercilessly demand is a brand new faith. In 988, Vladimir marches on Chersonesus, known to the Rus as Korsun. This is a massive narrative that we already explored separately during the history of Anastas, and we will not rehash it now. We will simply state what is essential for today's discussion. The prince marches to the Byzantine stronghold of Chersonesus, captures it, fiercely demands the hand of Princess Anna from the emperors in Constantinople as payment for his military assistance, undergoes baptism in the process, and finally returns to Kyiv no longer as a pagan and no longer as the high priest of the grand pantheon, but as a Christian sovereign. Returning alongside him is his Porphyrogenita, his purple-born Greek wife, along with Greek clergy, Greek sacred texts, and a man named Anastasius of Cherson. While all of this monumental upheaval is occurring down in the south, Dobrynya remains up in Kyiv. The Grand Prince is away on a campaign, and someone has to hold the capital firmly together. He knows this specific job flawlessly, and in the historical sources covering these months, he leaves almost no discernible trace, which generally signifies that a man is doing his job flawlessly. The very first dispatches from Chersonesus arrive gradually. The city is taken. The prince is alive. Intense negotiations with the emperors are underway. Then comes the shattering news, a revelation that Kyiv is only as prepared for as anyone can possibly be prepared for such a thing. The prince has been baptized. He will bring back a Greek wife. He will bring back Greek priests. Exactly what Dobrynya feels upon reading this dispatch, the sources stubbornly refuse to report. And it is right here that we must pause, because the absolute silence of the primary source speaks volumes in and of itself. The primary chronicle describes the dramatic baptism of Kyiv in exquisite detail. It describes how the towering idols are violently chopped down, how Perun is tied to a horse's tail and brutally dragged down from the hill, along the Borachev descent, straight toward the Dnieper River, how 12 men mercilessly beat him with heavy sticks, not to shatter the solid wood, but to publicly humiliate the god, how the idol slowly drifts down the Dnieper, and how the prince orders his men to chase it all the way down to the river rapids, aggressively preventing it from washing ashore so that no one can ever pull it out. All of these are highly vivid scenes that the chronicler deliberately painted so they would burn themselves into memory forever. But there is not a single solitary word about what the man who had personally erected that very pantheon just 10 years prior was feeling or thinking during this exact moment. And he was absolutely there. According to all available data, Dobrynya is residing in Kyiv during this time, and the mass baptism of the Kievan citizens, as well as the spectacular preceding overthrow of the idols, occurs directly before his eyes. He could not have failed to witness it. According to one historical reconstruction, he was among the very first to personally accept baptism, doing so as a senior member of the princely clan long before the massive public baptism of the townsfolk in the Putyata River. And regarding all of this, absolute silence. The silence of a historical source is not a rare occurrence in the work of a historian.
Most often, it simply means that the chronicler genuinely did not know. Sometimes, it means he did not consider the detail important enough to record. But occasionally, it signifies a third possibility. The chronicler absolutely knew, but actively chose not to write it down, because the question that would inevitably arise from doing so was profoundly uncomfortable for him. 10 years ago, Dobrynya personally carried Perun all the way to Novgorod, that very same idol, with the gleaming silver head and the golden mustache. He performed the exact sacred rituals before it that were required to be performed. And before such an idol, according to the primary chronicle's own descriptions of Kyiv, not merely words, but blood sacrifices were offered. Today, this exact same Perunor, its identical twin, is being dragged through the filth toward the river and beaten with sticks right before his eyes. If you dare to ask the question, what must the man who erected it have felt watching this? You will eventually have to answer it, and the answer will be deeply uncomfortable. The chronicler never asked the question. We are asking it, but we will state honestly, we do not possess the answer. We possess only the officially documented fact of absolute silence, and the profound understanding that, on that day, Dobrynya still remained a human being. During these same tumultuous months, an entirely new complication enters his life. Arriving from Chersonesus alongside the prince is Anastasius, and he is rapidly handed complete control over the Church of the Tithes, the massive treasury of the Church's new economy, the vital documents, and the steady revenues. In the old system, absolutely all of this would have routed through Dobrynya in one form or another, not explicitly as the royal treasurer, but seamlessly as the senior relative without whose trusted counsel no major decisions were ever made. Now, standing right alongside this old, informal network of power, a rigid, formal one emerges, a Greek outsider possessing his own immense authority and operating on his own distinct logic. Their very first encounter is not described anywhere in the texts, and we do not actually need it described in granular detail. The broader history of Anastasius concluded in the specific episode dedicated to him. Only one thing matters. They politely exchange greetings and immediately part ways. And from that day forward, a mirror appears in the princely court for Dobrynya, cold, ruthlessly rational, completely alien mirror. And this mirror stares back at him every single day. And it is precisely then that the dark news arrives from the north. The dispatch is brief. Novgorod has categorically refused to be baptized voluntarily. The Veche assembly has formally decreed they will not surrender Perun under any circumstances. The priests, dispatched from Kyiv on a diplomatic mission entirely devoid of armed support, were allowed into the city,
politely listened to, and firmly asked to leave. The city is not declaring war, it is simply saying no. And as long as no one has actively attempted to break that no with raw force, it holds perfectly firm. Vladimir summons his council. Invited into the chamber are the men without whom decisions of this immense magnitude are simply never made. The Metropolitan, several elite commanders of the senior Družina Putyata among them, and, because the crisis explicitly involves Novgorod, a city that the entire princely court knows from one perspective, while exactly one man in this court knows it from another, they also invite Dobrynya. Dobrynya enters. He sits down exactly where he has always sat. He waits for the prince to speak, and it is in this heavy, lingering anticipation that one life abruptly ends, because the one that will begin in this very chamber an hour from now will be an entirely different life altogether. Before we walk into this chamber, we must clarify one thing. The specific scene we are about to witness does not exist in an expanded, detailed form in the primary sources. The primary chronicle limits itself to a single, painfully brief line stating merely that Dobrynya went to baptize Novgorod, and it stubbornly refuses to explain exactly how that brutal decision was reached. What we are about to show you is a historical reconstruction, leaning heavily on the sheer logic of the situation and the known roster of men who were genuinely present by the prince's side during these exact months. The grand chamber inside the princely palace. A heavy wooden table. Benches. Seated around the table are Vladimir, the Metropolitan, a handful of seasoned commanders of the senior Družina, among them Putyata, Anastas, and Dobrynya. They are debating a single issue. Novgorod has refused. Leaving the situation as it is absolutely impossible. The entire north will inevitably fracture and break away right behind it, and the baptism of Kyiv will be left dangling in the air as a purely localized event. They already tried sending another peaceful, unarmed mission. Only one viable option remains: to send an armed one. Who will go? Names are thrown out. Every single name immediately crashes into the exact same wall of logic. A complete stranger will face armed resistance in Novgorod from the very first day. The city has intimately known how to handle its strangers since the 970s, and any random commander sent blindly north will inevitably trigger a full-blown rebellion, not a baptism. They desperately need a man who has a name there, not a set of orders, but a name. Not a sprawling army at his back, but the city's deep memory of him. In this entire chamber, there is exactly one such man. What happens next is something that, in our reconstruction, we will convey through a heavy pause, rather than through spoken words. Vladimir's gaze locks onto his uncle, and it does not shift away. Absolute silence descends upon the chamber, not because anyone actively orchestrated it, but because every single man sitting there simultaneously understands. The prince is finally looking exactly where he needed to look all along, and with that heavy stare, he is saying what he is completely unwilling to say aloud. It is not even an order. An order has to be spoken, and once spoken, it possesses a shape that can be formally answered. What is happening right now has no shape. It is pure, suffocating expectation. It is the silent, unbearable shifting of a crushing weight onto one man in the room, a weight that absolutely no one else can carry, simply because no one else possesses the right name in the right city. Dobrynya remains silent for a very long time. In this fleeting minute, he still could have refused. He could have smoothly cited his advancing age. He is well into his 50s, and no one would have dared accuse him of cowardice. He could have argued that Novgorod was far too much his city, and that such brutal work required a man with a much colder heart. He could have pointed directly at Putyata, proposing to pair him with a seasoned diplomat from the Greek clergy. He could have said one single word, no, and that word would have been respected, because the uncle of the Grand Prince possesses the absolute right to use it. He does not say it. Why? We will leave as an open question.
You could easily explain it through his profound loyalty to his nephew. You could explain it through his chilling realization that a total stranger would make the situation infinitely worse. You could explain it through a grim feeling that this was his own inescapable debt to pay, simply because he was the one who had erected Perun there in the first place. Every single one of these explanations is partially correct, but the truly honest answer, it seems, is that in this exact moment, a man steps forward to do a terrible thing he desperately does not want to do, because a crushing weight has already amassed inside him, and accepting the very job he cannot refuse suddenly feels like the only possible way to tear that weight out of himself. We suspect that he himself could not articulate this with words. He stands up. It is a brief, sharp, physical movement, a man gathering himself together right before he speaks. He says exactly 2 words: I will go. And right here, this is the one and only place in the entire episode where we will allow ourselves to freeze time and speak directly from ourselves. In this exact second, Dobrynya still could have taken his words back. He could have attached a heavy caveat, asked for a night to carefully consider it, laid out a specific condition under which he would be allowed to return. I will go, but if they absolutely refuse, I am coming back. Literally anything that would leave the door cracked slightly open. He does absolutely none of this. The words are spoken without a single condition, and from those spoken words onward, the man he had been for the last 30 years abruptly ceases to exist, because everything that is going to happen up in Novgorod will no longer unfold from his own free will. It will unfold strictly from his one-time consent. We return to the chamber. Vladimir nods, not like a man who just enthusiastically got what he wanted, but like a man who just got exactly what he feared. From the precise way he drops his eyes back to the table, it is glaringly obvious. He perfectly understands the horrific price of what he just extracted from his uncle, and he absolutely loathes that price. From there, the conversation shifts to logistics. Putyata will march alongside Dobrynya. The size of the war band, the longboats, the supply route, the deadlines. Someone, quite possibly Anastas, mentions that they still have Bogomil up in Novgorod, the old high priest, the one they call the Nightingale. He will not yield. The name is uttered out loud for the very first time in this council, and it is uttered clinically, simply as one of the logistical obstacles that must be overcome. Dobrynya hears this name and answers absolutely nothing. Anastas most likely does not even know that the man he just formally listed as a strategic obstacle is the old, trusted partner of the very man they just dispatched to solve the problem. This is going to be intensely personal. The council adjourns. A few days later, the heavily armed Dobrynya loads into the longboats and heads north along the familiar, ancient route up the Dnieper, over the portages, down the Lovert, into Lake Ilmen, and onto the Volkhov. Dobrynya has traveled this exact road dozens of times. Right now, he is traveling it for the very last time, as a man for whom Novgorod
is still a city to which he can safely return. The longboats glide into the Volkhov in the late summer of 990. The sprawling city lies draped across both banks of the river, connected by the great wooden bridge. On the trade side, the bustling merchant quarters and the massive market. On the Sofia side, the prince's heavily fortified courtyard, the Posadnik, the city's mayor, and sitting high above the river, the hill of Peryn with its pagan sanctuary. The bridge, in these tense days, is the absolute most critical asset to hold. Dobrynya disembarks on the trade side and spends his very first hours doing exactly what he has excelled at his entire life: talking. He goes directly to the merchant elders, men he has known intimately since the 970s, and attempts to explain. The prince has officially adopted a new faith. The city will have to adopt it too, and the cost of resisting will be catastrophically higher than the cost of agreeing. He does not threaten them. He does not mention Putyata's heavily armed Druzhina waiting behind his back. He speaks exactly as he always knew how to speak, with the profound understanding that you simply cannot issue brute orders to Novgorod. The merchant elders listen politely. They reply that a decision of this colossal magnitude is made strictly by the Veche, and that the Veche has already formally decreed they will not surrender Perun. If he truly wants this decree reconsidered, he must step out and address the city himself. This is, in essence, the single solitary path he has left. To aggressively unleash force without stepping before the Veche first means permanently incinerating the very name and reputation for which he was sent here in the first place. The Veche convenes at Yaroslav's court. The heads of the great clans, the senior merchants, the powerful representatives of the boroughs, the Varangian centurions, and the ordinary townsfolk all gather. From the Sofia side, crossing over the great bridge, come the men without whom this assembly holds no meaning: the Posadnik, Ugonyay, and Bogomil. Before we advance any further, we must pause, because a stop here is absolutely mandatory. The vast majority of what we are about to narrate, the passionate speeches at the Veche, the specific names of Ugonyay and Bogomil, the brutal sequence of events that follows, is known to us from one single historical source. It is called the Joachim Chronicle, and its status within historical science is notoriously complex. The chronicle itself has not survived to our time. We only know it through a detailed summary compiled in the 18th century by Vasily Tatichev, who, by his own account, meticulously copied the text from an ancient manuscript that fell into his hands and was subsequently lost forever. A fraction of researchers firmly believe Tatichev was summarizing a genuinely authentic ancient text. Another fraction believes he simply fabricated it. The vast majority agree that the truth lies squarely in the middle. The text did exist, but Tatichev heavily edited it. So what do we do with this? We use it, but we honestly inform you of the source's complicated status. The names, the moniker the Nightingale, the famous saying Putyata baptized with the sword and Dobrynya with fire, absolutely all of it comes directly from there. Without it, we would possess neither the characters nor the vivid scenes. Yet archaeology aggressively speaks in its favor. Modern excavations on the Sofia side have undeniably uncovered a massive ash layer indicating a catastrophic fire at the exact end of the 10th century, and it burned simultaneously across multiple distinct streets, the undisputed signature of deliberate, coordinated arson, not an accidental blaze. This is not absolute proof, but it is a colossal coincidence that simply cannot be ignored. We return to Yaroslav's court. Ugonyay is the very first to speak. The chronicle delivers his speech almost like a battle cry, a terse, punchy formula, and it is in this exact form that it, by all appearances, embedded itself into the city's collective memory. Better for us to die than to give our gods over to desecration. This is absolutely not a theological argument. It is a political one. Our gods represent what we freely chose, and we will not surrender them without blood. The crowded square responds with a massive roar, carrying far more furious agreement than hesitation. And then Bogomil steps forward. And right here, we must tread extremely carefully. What he is about to say is not merely a repetition of Ugonyay framed in a religious wrapper. It is something entirely different. He carries the moniker, the Nightingale, by absolute right. His voice is not deafeningly loud, yet it possesses a quality that allows the entire square to hear him without the slightest strain.
He does not summon the crowd to their deaths. He reminds them. 10 years ago, he says, on that very hill rising above the Volkhov, Perun was erected. Erected by the exact same man who has arrived today to chop him down. By the exact same man, by his exact same hand. He calls out Dobrynya's name and slowly turns to face him directly. Back then, he says, you brought this god to us and declared that it was the absolute truth. We believed you. We swore our solemn oaths to him. For 10 long years, we offered him exactly what was required. Today, you have arrived to violently demand the exact opposite. If you were lying to us back then, why on earth should we believe you now? If you were not lying to us back then, why are you standing here today? The massive square falls dead silent. Dobrynya remains silent. He remains silent for a very long time, and the square reads this silence flawlessly. The man is not answering because he is disdainful. He is not answering because he has absolutely nothing to answer with. And Bogomil, who had been waiting for an answer, also falls silent, because that heavy silence already contains absolutely everything he needed to expose. 2 old men standing a mere 3 paces apart. One arrived to hack everything down. The other arrived to defend it. Both inherently know that by dawn, one of them will either be dead or utterly broken. And both deeply understand, fueled by Bogomil's devastating words, now hanging heavy in the air, that the distance between them is not nearly as vast as either of them would prefer to believe. They are the exact same man, standing on opposite ends of the exact same decade. The Veche assembly disperses without reaching a final decision, which practically means without deciding to accept baptism. The ironclad decree of the previous assembly remains in full effect. Perun will not be surrendered. By evening, Ugonyay marches back across the great bridge to the Sofia side, taking the city militia with him. The massive bridge is drawn up tightly behind him. All physical connection between the 2 halves of the city is abruptly severed. The city has locked itself down. Dobrynya is staring at 2 options. He can turn his longboats around and sail away, which would provide him with immense personal salvation, but would signify total failure, returning empty-handed and triggering the total secession of the north from the Kievan order. Or he can cross the river. By morning, the Volkhov River separating the 2 halves of the city will transform into a bleeding, watery border, and it is precisely then that Putyata steps into the fray. Between the dark night when the bridge was drawn up
and the pale morning when the Sofia side found itself violently gripped by the Kievan Druzhina, several tense hours passed. What exactly unfolded during those dark hours is described in the Joachim Chronicle far more briefly than we would like, and almost all of it has to be meticulously reconstructed through cold military logic. We will do exactly that right now, with the explicit caveat that we are reconstructing based on logic, not quoting verbatim. The tactical decision is made directly by Putyata. Dobrynya remains on the trade side during these critical hours. She is the man whose name still carries heavy weight in the city, and that name cannot be carelessly incinerated in a chaotic night assault. Putyata is the seasoned commander of the Kievan warband, brought along for exactly this kind of brutal work. He is an outsider to this city, and strangely enough, that is his greatest strength. He genuinely does not care whose throat he is grabbing. The plan is ancient and brilliantly simple. If the central bridge is drawn you, outflank them by water. A detachment of the warband silently slips into small, shallow boats and rows hard up the Volga River, pushing past the city limits, using the boats to cross where absolutely no one is expecting them. The city is fiercely guarding the bridge because the bridge is the most critical asset. They simply lack the manpower to defend the distant, sprawling stretches of the riverbank. Putyata executes his flanking maneuver, and by dawn he emerges on the Sofia side, far away from the heavily fortified center. What follows happens incredibly fast. They ghost through the dark streets toward Ugonyay's estate, making no sound. Whoever from the city militia happens to be guarding the house is silently eliminated or swiftly subdued. Ugonyay himself is dragged directly from his bed. The chronicle states he was seized before he even had time to fully wake up. And this is almost certainly the truth. Absolute surprise was the only viable chance they had, and Putyata played it flawlessly. Ugonyay is bound tightly and dragged back toward the boats. The city does not realize what has happened immediately. First comes a faint rumor, then the sudden realization that it is far too quiet around the Posadnik's estate, and then the shocking sight of a foreign war band standing right by the river crossing. By the time the trade side on the opposite bank grasps exactly what has occurred, Putyata's men are already holding their ground on the Sofia Sidea small detachment, but fiercely disciplined and large enough to choke off the main street leading up to the sanctuary. And it is exactly now that the violent chaos begins, an eruption the Joachim Chronicle describes as the sheer unbridled fury of the Novgorodians. The city violently wakes up. A Veche forms on the trade side, not a formally summoned assembly, but a wild, spontaneous mob. They scream that the Kievans have treacherously kidnapped their mayor through deceit. They scream that they must cross the river and butcher them to get him back. They scream names. And then, following the natural logic of a violently escalating mob, the massive crowd pivots toward the one target they can actually reach, Dobrynya and his Druzhina, who are standing right here on the trade side. Here we must pause and make a crucial clarification. The terrifying scene we are about to describe does not explicitly appear in the Joachim Chronicle. Tatishov merely mentions that the Novgorodians brutally assaulted the Kievans and smashed their property, but he does not write specifically about Dobrynya's personal estate. We are reconstructing this precise detail purely through logic, because there is simply no other way to explain the staggering brutality with which Dobrynya will act by noon. For him to issue the horrific order to burn the city to the ground, there had to be a deeply personal breaking point, and this break, by all accounts, must have been triggered by something specific happening right before his eyes. This is our reconstruction, and we are clearly marking it as such. The The roaring mob surges toward Dobrynya's courtyard. This massive estate has stood on the trade side for many years, perhaps since the 970s, when Dobrynya ruled Novgorod as regent, or perhaps even earlier. We do not know the exact date. The main house, the sprawling urban estate, the stables, the outbuildings, a home that served as the city's ultimate proof that Dobrynya was a local, one of their own. The mob sets it on fire. The flames spread incredibly fast. Wooden structures on a bone-dry summer day burn to ash in a matter of minutes. The household servants rush out, fighting back. Some are severely wounded, others are slaughtered. A contingent of Dobrynya's Druzhina stationed at the estate plunges into the melee, but standing against a massive mob, fueled by deep betrayal and spontaneous fury, is nearly impossible, and they fight not for victory, but merely to bleed the crowd while retreating back toward the longboats. Dobrynya himself, it seems, is not at the estate at this exact moment. He is down by the water, closer to the bridge, precisely where the main bulk of his war band is amassed. Men sprint to him and deliver the news. What he does next, we can only see through the brutal results. He gives the order to cross the river. The massive wooden bridge, drawn up for the night, is now either violently forced down or bypassed using the exact same flanking maneuver Putyata used on small boats, pushing up or down the current. Dobrynya's Druzhina, hardened Kievans mixed with northern mercenaries, storms onto the Sofia side. And it is precisely here, in the very first chaotic hours after they breach the opposite bank, that the city plunges into what the Joachim Chronicle chillingly calls the street battles. The city does not fight back like a conventional army. It fights back exactly like a city. Every single district boasts its own localized war band, its own fierce militia, its own stubborn men ready to stand and die at the gates of their own courtyards. This is not one grand, sweeping battle. It is dozens of vicious, microscopic ones at a specific gate, down a specific alley, over a specific intersection. The Kievan Druzhina grinds forward agonizingly slowly, street by street, courtyard by courtyard, district by district. Wherever they can strike a deal, they strike a deal. A number of streets surrender without a drop of blood spilled, because their pragmatic elders have already calculated the horrific price of resistance and realized the cost far exceeds any possible victory. Wherever they cannot strike a deal, they hack their way through. Putyata, tightly guarding the captured Ugonyay, fiercely holds his sector and gradually manages to link up with the main advancing force. By noon, the half of the city that violently dug its heels in, the ones refusing to yield, shrinks down to a few heavily fortified streets surrounding Perun's sanctuary and several massive Varangian and merchant estates whose defenders are ready to fight to the very last man. This is the half that belongs to fire and sword. This is Putyata's portion of the work. This is exactly what will cement itself into the famous proverb as baptized with the sword. And right at this moment, Dobrynya climbs to a high vantage point, perhaps up a hill, perhaps merely onto the roof of one of the estates his warband has just seized, and he stares down at the city from above. The city is burning, not all of it. Several dense blocks on the trade side have caught fire from the initial blaze at his own estate, and the inferno is rapidly expanding because, on a dry summer day with the wind whipping off the river, fire jumps effortlessly. Thick, choking black smoke hangs heavily over multiple streets simultaneously. You can see terrified people running, some desperately sprinting toward the water, some fleeing the city into the open fields, some scrambling up toward the sanctuary, desperately hoping that Perun might finally intervene. And somewhere deep within that maze of blazing roofs is the very street where Dobrynya spent his earliest years as regent, the very house where he lived back when he was not yet the terrifying uncle of the Grand Prince, but simply a patient mentor guarding a 10-year-old boy, the very neighbors whose names he knew by heart. By noon or early evening, the Joachim Chronicle does not specify the exact hour. Dobrynya issues his next command, and this order is directed not at Putyata, but directly at his own loyal men. Burn down the houses where anyone continuing to resist is hiding. This is the absolute point of no return. Up until this specific order, he had operated through the hands of an outsider. Putyata was doing the hacking.
From this order onward, he will do the burning himself. By the end of the day, the city goes dead silent. It has not formally surrendered, it has simply been silenced. Ugonyay has been captured and abruptly falls out of the remaining narrative. His ultimate fate is never detailed by Tatishov. Most likely, he is held under heavy guard and later dragged away or executed on the spot, but we leave that lingering just off camera. The grand sanctuary of Perun at Peryn remains entirely untouched. Absolutely no one has approached it yet. Both the Kievan war band and the shattered remnants of the city militia inherently understand that the sanctuary is not merely a wooden structure. It is the absolute last place on earth where the city still has a god who might, just might, intercede for them. Those who still blindly believe he will intercede have congregated there, and standing among them is Bogomil. The Joachim Chronicle says absolutely nothing about Bogomil's exact fate on this horrific night.
Cold logic dictates he must have been up there at the sanctuary because that is where he belongs, and because he quite literally has nowhere else to run. But the Chronicle remains completely silent, and we will act honestly. We will leave his exact whereabouts a mystery until the sun comes up. Morning breaks over a city that is far quieter than a sprawling, massive trading hub has any right to be in the morning. Here and there, embers are still smoldering. Here and there, people are quietly bandaging wounds.
Here and there they are gathering the dead, and Dobrynya profoundly realizes that, over the course of the night, he has only finished half the job. The city has been silenced, but it has not accepted. The sanctuary still stands, Perun still stands, and as long as Perun still stands, the city retains a god to whom it can always return. And after the absolute horrors committed during the night, there must be zero possibility left of ever returning. For this to truly end, he must take one final step, and this step he will take himself. By morning, the reality was brutally clear. As long as Peryn stood tall on Perinth, city was not defeated. As long as that physical anchor existed, absolutely everything that had transpired during the night could easily be undone. To prevent that from happening, he had to ensure there was absolutely nowhere left to return to. Dobrynya's order was chillingly simple and horrific. Burn the houses where those who continue to resist are hiding. Fire used strictly as an instrument of statecraft. Not explicitly to kill, although the dead would be many, but so that the survivors would understand with agonizing clarity. The middle ground where one could safely sit this out no longer existed. By noon, the vast majority of the Sofia side had either surrendered or was engulfed in flames. People were fleeing, some plunging toward the Volkhov, desperately hoping to swim across. Others scrambling toward the sanctuary, driven by the exact same primal instinct that drives people across all eras to run to temples when their city has absolutely no hope left. Dobrynya's warband approaches the sanctuary, moving as a small, tight detachment,
because a massive army is no longer required here. No one is fighting here anymore. They are merely waiting for the end. Dobrynya walks up to the idol personally, up the hill of Peryn, the very hill he himself had consecrated 10 long years ago. A total stranger can chop down houses. A total stranger can chop down men. But the man who erected the idol must be the one to chop the idol down. Standing before the sanctuary is a small, quiet group, a handful of battered city warriors, a few young priests, and Bogomil himself standing directly beside the idol, standing on the exact same spot where 10 years prior he had warmly welcomed the grand procession arriving from the south. The war band halts at the lower edge of the hill. It is a silent gesture understood flawlessly by both sides. What is about to happen next belongs exclusively to these two old men. They stand mere paces apart. Hanging in the space between them are 10 long years, a massive wooden pillar topped with a silver head, and the heavy memory of a day when both men firmly believed they were accomplishing a single righteous task. Bogomil speaks first. He speaks entirely without malice. He possesses neither the time nor the reason for malice anymore. 10 years ago you sang hymns to this god. What exactly changed in the god? He is offering his opponent an out, a massive rhetorical space. A chance to say, I have seen the light. A chance to say, the one true God has arrived, and now my eyes are open. Anything that Dobrynya could step into, something that would make it infinitely easier for him to live with himself afterward. Dobrynya does not step into that space. What he answers, perhaps it is a brief, terse phrase, perhaps it is absolute silence. His internal answer is singular. Absolutely nothing changed in the god. What changed were the orders. But he cannot say this phrase out loud. His war band will hear it, and the very people he is about to violently baptize will hear it. And a baptism delivered at such a catastrophic price will hold firm only until the very next order arrives. And so, Dobrynya remains silent, and within that heavy silence, Bogomil receives the exact answer he was waiting for. Bogomil nods. He takes a single step back, not retreating in surrender, but simply clearing the space. What follows are axes, splitting wood, heavy, rhythmic blows. The towering idol, having withstood the howling winds on this hill for a decade, does not yield easily. Heavy ropes are lashed around it, and it is brutally dragged down the hill toward the water, exactly the same way its counterpart was dragged through the mud in Kyiv 2 years ago. They hurl it into the Volkhov. The massive idol bobs to the surface, and it begins to slowly drift away with the current, drifting northward, exactly the way all waters flow in these lands. Standing on the banks, there is no roaring cheer of victory, nor is there any wailing cry of grief. Dobrynya stands perfectly still by the water, watching the idol drift away. Today, he did not burn paganism. Paganism is a deeply rooted layer that takes generations to burn away, and long after this day, Novgorod will secretly keep its ancient gods hidden in the dark corners of its wooden huts. Modern archaeologists excavating 1,000 years later will confirm this absolutely. He burned something else entirely. He burned the ability to go back. A city that today had half its streets incinerated and its primary sanctuary drowned in the river cannot simply change its mind a year from now and say, "We were just joking." After a fire like this, the road back no longer exists. And he was the absolute only man who could have done this. Novgorod would never have given a stranger a chance. They would have slaughtered him on the threshold. But they gave one of their own a chance to walk out to the Veche. They gave him the floor to speak. They gave him the chance to try. And precisely because he is one of their own, they will never, ever forgive him for what happened next. By this exact minute, Bogomil is no longer standing at the sanctuary. Exactly when he walked away, whether at the very first axe blow to the base, the moment the idol crashed down, or the moment it was violently dragged down the slope, no one could confidently say afterward. The Joachim Chronicle contains absolutely nothing regarding his ultimate fate. He was not executed, he was not taken captive, he was not forcibly converted, he was not exiled. He simply vanished. The city will never see him again. History will never record him again. He remains the lingering question to which, 10 years ago, his interlocutor could find no answer, and he quietly walks away, taking that question with him forever. Dobrynya turns away from the water and walks slowly back into the city, down the charred, blackened streets, toward the exact spot where, just yesterday, the home of his childhood used to stand. A few weeks later, the city is still standing. It is not whole. The incinerated streets remain exactly that, incinerated, and they will not be fully rebuilt until winter, and in some places, not until spring. But the city is already breathing again. Inside the walled estates, they are bitterly calculating their losses. On the trade side, the merchants are already reappearing, because in Novgorod, commerce is the very first thing to resurrect itself. Silver does not patiently wait for the last embers to cool. On the Sofia side, it is much quieter. There, they are clearing debris, burying the dead, bandaging the wounded, and slowly rebuilding. And during these exact same weeks, the baptisms are taking place. Not at all like the joyous baptisms in Kyiv, down by the Putyata River, filled with soaring hymns, the ringing sermons of the priests, an atmosphere of festive solemnity, and the prince standing proudly on the shore. In Novgorod, they baptize in absolute, grim silence. The Novgorodians wade into the Volkhov strictly under orders, stepping into the exact same water that still intimately remembers the massive idol that drifted northward. They step in, they step out. They silently disperse back to their courtyards. The priest, imported from the south, recites exactly what he is required to recite. They listen to the priest precisely because they are required to listen. An hour later, the entire ordeal is over, and a man walks back to his house, officially converted. Occasionally, especially during the very first few days, scenes unfold by the water that never found their way into the chronicles, but which, by all logic, absolutely must have happened. A mother wades into the freezing river, clutching a child in her arms. An old man wades in, his back completely unbending. A wealthy merchant wades in, looking exactly as though he is paying a tax, because, for him, that is essentially what this is, a brutal tax, the heavy price the city must now pay simply to survive another day. It is during these exact same weeks that a new proverb is born in the city. Nobody remembered exactly who uttered it first. Perhaps it was a fisherman who watched the grim processions shuffling down to the water. Perhaps it was a blacksmith, idling because the massive orders from the incinerated streets had not yet arrived. Perhaps it was a woman, anxiously waiting for her husband to return from burying their slaughtered kin. It is spoken briefly, and wrapped within that brevity is the folk habit of finding the exact, unsparing words. Putyata baptized with the sword, and Dobrynya with fire. This is absolutely not a compliment. It is not a theological critique. It is a cold, hard fixation forged into a tight rhyme, exactly the way folk speech forges death sentences, which are then carried far longer than the condemned man himself ever lived. The names of two commanders, two brutal instruments, utterly devoid of moral judgment. Judgment is completely unnecessary. It is already baked directly into the formula, deeply embedded in the fact that between the two verbs there is no and, there is a but, one with the sword, the other with fire. The common folk will remember them both, but fire is far more terrifying than the sword, and within this grim formula, Dobrynya is handed a legacy far heavier than Putyata's. That an invading commander hacked them down, that is perfectly understandable. But that one of their own burned his own people to the ground, that is what was permanently seared into memory as the one thing that can never be forgiven. Dobrynya sails back to Kyiv in the late autumn. The warband loads back into the longboats. Sitting in those boats are the men who arrived here in the summer, and the men who have been ordered to stay behind to live and serve. There are fewer occupied seats on the benches than there were on the journey up. A number of the men will never return. They are lying forever in Novgorodian soil, which is now officially baptized soil. The city watches them leave in absolute silence. Standing on the docks are neither people crying in sorrow nor people screaming curses at their backs. The merchant elders, the very same men with whom Dobrynya patiently learned to negotiate back in the 970s, stand silently on the riverbank, because it is strictly required to stand when the prince's envoy departs. They nod briefly, they do not step forward. The longboats pull away from the shore. They row hard up the Volkhov, heading south, back toward Lake Ilmen, and further on over the portages toward the Dnieper. The exact same route he took to get here in the summer, a perfect mirror image. Dobrynya stands at the stern. The city slowly fades away behind him. First the massive wooden walls, then only the absolute peaks of the rooftops, then the hill of Peryn, completely empty, entirely devoid of its idol, then nothing but a thin gray strip of shoreline, and soon even that is completely gone. His ultimate fate vanishes into the mist of the historical sources. The primary chronicle mentions him just a few more times, fleetingly, as background color during routine princely affairs. Sometime around the year 1000, his name evaporates from the chronicles entirely. The exact date of his death remains totally unknown. His grave has never been found. There are absolutely no recorded posthumous decrees, no grand legends detailing his final words, no vivid descriptions of his funeral. He simply ended. 200 years later, across both northern and southern Rus, they will sing Belinas, the epic folk poems. In these sweeping epics, a mighty bogatyr named Dobrynya Nikitich will appear. He will serve Prince Vladimir at the Grand Court in Kiev. He will bravely rescue Zabava Putyatichna from the terrifying serpent. He will ride out to battle the Tatarsa, glaring anachronism that bothers absolutely no one in the Belinas. He will be incredibly kind, profoundly wise, and unfailingly reliable. He will have a loving wife, the fiercely loyal Nastasia. He will have a majestic warhorse. He will wield a massive mace. He will possess all that unbound, heroic strength that, in actual reality, Dobrynya Malkovich, the uncle of Prince Vladimir, spent not on glorious bogatyr-style feats, but on brutal, agonizing work that left behind neither a marked grave nor a joyful song. Memory knows perfectly well how to protect itself. 200 years later, the distant descendants of the very people he ruthlessly baptized with fire, will compose sweeping epics about him. In these epics, he will rescue innocent maidens from dragons rather than incinerating city streets. The grim uncle of the great baptizer will magically transform into a legendary hero with a mace. And that, in essence, is the one and only payment that Novgorod ultimately agreed to give him. If we attempt to distill the absolute meaning of everything we have traversed over these last 90 minutes into a single phrase, a short phrase simply will not suffice. It will be this: one man, over the span of exactly 10 years, entirely overhauled the faith of the exact same city twice. Not because he experienced a spiritual rebirth, and absolutely not because he was a pathological liar. He was profoundly loyal, not to a faith, but to a family, to his nephew, and to the bloodline through which that nephew violently seized power. Peryn was desperately needed to solidify that power. Christ was needed for the exact same reason. The theological substance swapped out completely. The underlying logic never changed for a second. The sprawling state that was brutally forged through this cold logic ultimately succeeded. The nephew marched into history as the great baptizer, a revered saint, the absolute founder of Christian Rus. Cities would be named in his honor, grand monuments would be erected to him, and his face would be stamped onto coins 1,000 years later. The uncle, thanks to whom absolutely all of this became entirely possible, remained in history merely as a brief line in someone else's chronicle and a bitter proverb in someone else's city, and also as a silver head nailed to a wooden pillar, drifting slowly down the Volga River into the north. We have been walking through this cycle for 4 episodes now, and in every single one of them, the exact same man has appeared right beside the main protagonist, never in the lead role, always off to the side. Next to Svenelta was merely the pawn, the boy whom the adults viciously fought over. In the tragic fate of Rognedahe, became the brutal enforcer who arrived for the bride and utterly refused to hear the word no. Standing beside Anastasia turned out to be the reigning prince for whom an entirely new faith was meticulously constructed. Today, standing next to Dobrynya was the sovereign nephew who issued the horrific order that his uncle simply could not refuse to execute. 4 distinct figures, 4 entirely different angles of vision on the exact same man. Next time, we will finally look directly at him without leaning on someone else's shoulder, without staring through someone else's gaze, without the safety of a convenient vantage point from the side. Vladimir Sviatoslavich, the son of a slave, the brother killer, the baptizer, the saint. Exactly one of these 4 is the real man. Or, perhaps, none of them are. We are going to find out. If this conversation is important to you, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the massive final episode of this series. Leave a like. For us, this is the one and only way to truly understand that we need to keep making stories exactly like this. And write down in the comments exactly which of the 4 Vladimirs you believe is the real one. We will read every single response before we sit down to edit the next episode. Until we meet again,